Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1 GV at your service to describe a little antenna that I made several years ago. It's been over 10 years ago now, when I lived in Wisconsin, in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, in a grand old house on the upper floor for only $375 a month. They had a 1,200 square foot apartment in that place. It was a grand old kind of a mansion with the owners living downstairs and another guy living in a smaller apartment next door. And I got at that time my IC746 Pro ICOM. On a stormy day, I drove down to Mounds View, Minnesota, pretty close to 150 miles each way, and bought this IC746 Pro, and I still have that radio. Great little radio. And I also had a computer that I connected to it to listen to phase shift keying signals. Well, here's the house. Here is the kitchen window. Coaxial cable ran through the house to the radio in another room, probably about 50 feet of RG58U coaxial cable. At this point right here, I had an automatic antenna tuner. It was, I forget what it was called now. It was also made by ICOM, but it was an automatic antenna tuner. Then this was what you might call a random wire, only about maybe 10 feet off the ground. It ran maybe, I'd say maybe 60 feet to the garage. And at the garage, there's another building here. A wire ran down the wall of the garage to a ground rod at the far end of this random wire. Now, the far end of that random wire was grounded, okay? But that doesn't really make any difference from a performance standpoint as long as your wire is a significant fraction of a wavelength long, at least a quarter of a wavelength long. It's really just with an automatic antenna tuner like this, it could tune practically anything. This antenna performed amazingly well. Now, one of the attributes of this house was it was on top of a hill. And I think sometimes that your actual location, geographically and topographically, is more important than how high your antenna is above the ground or the surface itself. If you're in a gulch, way down in a gulch or a deep ravine, you're not going to get any kind of reception or transmission, even if you have a great antenna. On the other hand, if you're on top of a hill with a good view and a good earth ground, and in Wisconsin, by the way, they've got pretty good soil. So I ran a few radial wires out from this as best I could along the side of the garage. And then along the side of the house, I ran one radial for each of the ham radio bands that I used. And it was a quarter wavelength radial on each one of those bands. Those bands were 7, 10, 14, 18, 21, 24, and 28 megahertz, and you can calculate the length of a quarter wave radial on each of those bands by taking 234 and dividing it by f, the frequency in megahertz. That'll give you the length of the radial in feet. radial, or you might call a counterpoise. And the neat thing, or the weird thing about this counterpoise, was it wasn't a horizontal counterpoise, it was vertical. So I fully expected these things to radiate. And radiate they did. And I did get RF in the shack with this system. RF in the house. It caused, if I ran more than about 50 watts of power, I began to experience trouble. So that was when I adopted my quasi-QRP attitude of 10 watts RF output as a standard for my operations. And with that 10 watts and this random wire antenna, I worked a station in Samoa. I worked New Zealand, I worked Europe, I worked quite a lot of DX with that system. And one of the other things that was kind of neat about this, for some reason when you have an antenna like this and you ground the far end of it, you may experience less noise problems in your radio. And the reason why I grounded this far end was because of lightning. I wanted this thing to be safe from lightning. If there was a nearby lightning strike, I wanted the electromagnetic pulse, the current surge from that, to go away from the house and down into this ground rod. I didn't want it coming in the house. Nevertheless, I disconnected the radio anyway when I wasn't using this antenna. In fact, I disconnected the antenna from the tuner too. So that basically then I would just have kind of a wire that was grounded. And I figured it would be harmless unless it took a direct hit. But all that said, of course, if you take a direct hit from a lightning bolt, it doesn't really matter very much where you are. I mean, I've heard about lightning coming through windows and striking people sitting there reading a book. So, I mean, if you're going to worry about every possible little thing that can go wrong, worry yourself to death. See if I care. But this antenna really worked pretty well, and it was a really funky, weird arrangement. But, whatever works, works. You gotta try things, when you think stuff up. If you think it's a neat idea and it might work, go ahead and do it, as long as it isn't gonna break your wallet. For now, I'll say 73 from W1GV in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Until next time, so long.